Los Angeles County Jail is like the biggest mental institution in the country, and Rikers, I think, is second, and then the streets are, maybe third, and then there are the scarce hospital beds. But I was always, interested in what called a neo-asylum movement. Bring back the asylums, for heaven's sakes. Now we have medication, so they would not necessarily be a lifelong residence for some people, but they might be for years. There's just a minority. It is a minority of these folks who just don't respond.
Welcome to the Unspeakeasy podcast. I'm your host, Meghan Daum, and this is the podcast formerly known as The Unspeakable, but it is now The Unspeakeasy. Before I introduce this week's guest, Dr. Sally Satel, a couple of announcements. The first is that I'm teaching a writing workshop early next year. Time to do one again. This is on Zoom. It's in personal essay and memoir, and it's running for 8 consecutive Tuesdays, January 6th through February 24th, from 3 to 5 p.m. Eastern Time. The way these work, they're small, not a lot of students, but you get a lot out of it. I have many repeat customers, so get your application in. The deadline is December 5th, and you can get all the info by going to the Substack post that is linked in the show notes. You can also find that at the Unspeakable Podcast. That's the Substack link. What else? I should tell you that dates for our 2026 Unspeakeasy retreats have been announced. We've got one in the spring in Los Angeles and several on the East Coast in the fall, including a 3-night women's writing retreat and a 2-night co-ed big retreat in the Hudson Valley. Registration at this point is only open for the Los Angeles retreat in April, but we will have the others open very soon, definitely before the end of the year. So go to theunspeakeasy.com to find out more. My guest, Dr. Sally Satel, is a psychiatrist and a writer who has spent decades working on the front lines of addiction and mental illness. She's been a practicing clinician in methadone clinics, a policy fellow in Washington, and is, in my view, one of the most thoughtful critics of how ideology has seeped into medicine. In this conversation, we talk about a number of things. We talk about a piece she published in the Free Press back in August, in which she, who is not generally a supporter of President Trump, said she was in favor of Trump's plan for helping the mentally ill. We talk about what she meant by that, as well as the history of deinstitutionalization, why it's so hard to get severely ill people into treatment, what harm reduction should and should not mean, and a lot of other stuff. I feel so fortunate to have had this conversation with Sally, and I am so glad to bring it to you. So enjoy. Dr. Sally Satel, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
I've been looking forward to talking with you for a long time now. You do so much interesting work. You're not only a writer and a public intellectual, which I guess is what we now call a thought leader, but you're a practicing psychiatrist who's dealt directly with the opioid crisis. Mm-hmm. You've worked in methadone clinics in the rural South and elsewhere. You have been a critic, a thoughtful critic of a lot of reductionist thinking that comes up in the field of psychiatry, the sort of, it's all about brain chemistry versus it's all about social justice binary. Mm-hmm. You've written about the concept of harm reduction, which is something I have a lot of questions about. So I think this conversation could go in any number of directions, and I hope it will. But I thought we would start by talking about a piece you published a few months ago, back in August, in the Free Press. It was called, "I'm a Psychiatrist, and I support Trump's plan for helping the mentally ill." Why don't we start by having you explain what Trump's plan is for helping the mentally ill?
Well, it wasn't a plan so much as, an executive order. And it was actually quite welcome to me as someone who's always been amenable to the notion of benign paternalism for certain people who are just unable to manage due to, in this case, severe mental illness. And by severe mental illness, I'm referring to the psychotic illnesses, schizophrenia, bipolar. Sometimes people with severe depression can become immobilized and effectively unable to care for themselves. On the street, you mostly see, I think, people with schizophrenia. In any case, this has been a problem, and the civil rights concerns surrounding it have been an issue for well over half a century. And I date it to half a century. I'm sure it went back much, much further, but half a century was when JFK actually tried to effectively liberate people from the mental institutions, the asylums, whatever you want to call them. And I should add that all these policies are state level, which is one reason why you're confused, is because they vary by state to state. Another reason for people to be confused is the use of the word mental health when we really mean mental illness. And so on October 31st, 1963, Kennedy signed the Community Mental Health Centers Act, which actually was the last bill he signed before he was assassinated. And it was the most moving statements about, releasing people from the cold mercy of institutional life. And around then, it was a time of some optimism. I mean, we were finally getting some antipsychotic medications that could really, they have side effects. They're imperfect for many people, but they are also transformative for some lucky people. And they'll probably always reduce some symptoms in others, where people might, I'm talking about Thorazine and Haldol and these kind of, first generation antipsychotics. So they could help people, live more independently. Plus, there was just an outcry. I think one of the first dramatic articles, I think maybe it was in Life magazine, and it was basically, an expose of asylum life. And then a 1948 book by Albert Deutsch, The Shame of the States. I mean, these were like, Snake Pit. In fact, Snake Pit movie came out around then. And so the public became really sensitized to these images and these really human rights violations. Plus the medications came along. Plus Kennedy had a family history of severe mental illness with his sister, Rosemary. And it's not quite clear to me if she was schizophrenic or had some kind of severe behavioral problem.
I thought she was like, quote unquote, mentally retarded.
It wasn't clear. I think some say she may have had a little of both. But anyway, she was lobotomized. And it didn't go according to plan. It almost never does go according to plan, unless your plan is to just sedate somebody into a regressed state. And was institutionalized then for the rest of her life, or had caretakers around 24/7. And I think he was traumatized. The family was traumatized by that. And so the convergence of all those dynamics led him to write this legislation. So that's great. The problem is the community in the Community Mental Centers Act was not there to receive these individuals. Psychiatry at the time was going through a phase of what was called community psychiatry, which was a very, you could use the word, very progressive outlook. And it was the idea that people were mentally ill as well as mentally unhealthy because of conditions, social conditions, the environment. So there were it was far enough after World War II when we just had an explosion of psychoanalysts in this country. So they were doing psychoanalysis with the worried well, getting involved with community practices, anti-poverty efforts. And very few were paying attention to these most desperately sick people. And so that was the beginning. The hospitals emptied out and they kept emptying out. And I think it's 90% of all beds that were once state hospitals are gone. And now we're living with this.
You say Kennedy, it's notable because for some reason I had it in my mind, and maybe this was the conventional wisdom, or maybe I'm just misremembering this, that it was like Reagan during the 80s. Like we always would hear, he emptied out all the mental hospitals and dumped all the people out onto the street. Is that like
no, that's years, 20 years later.
20 years later?
Yeah, what he did was it was a funding issue. And he is held in contempt by some people in my profession, and all the other social services for doing that, or reverting all the money to the states. I have to admit, I'm not as up to date on that history, but yes, he is considered responsible for adding to this problem, no question.
So the idea was that it would be community care. So they were going to shut down these hospitals, which, I mean, anybody who's read any of these books, and I think there were a couple of very notable documentaries that I remember seeing about this, like Titicut Follies. I think that was the Weissman brothers, just horrifying, like literal horror movie kind of stuff. And so anyone would say, well, of course, that's inhumane, shut these down. And so was the idea that there would be like what we now call wraparound services, or there would be like community health and social workers, and like what was it supposed to look like?
That there'd be psychiatrists who were interested in working with people with severe illnesses, and yes, there'd be residential homes for some. I don't think they used the word wraparound services then, but yeah, functionally the same thing. There may have been too much therapeutic optimism about these new drugs. That wouldn't be surprising, and so, yeah, they just, again, that just wasn't set up. Plus, they didn't even build enough of these. I mean, I don't know how many thousands of these community mental health centers were supposed to be built, but they weren't. Not enough of them were. Plus, they were housed by therapists who weren't equipped to deal with this kind of patient. Plus, the ethos of psychiatry, much of psychiatry at the time, as I said, had a social justice dimension to it.
You talk about how you were doing your training in the 1980s and 1990s, and you write, I encountered some of the sickest patients when I worked in a psychiatric emergency room in New Haven, Connecticut. You say, I saw people with schizophrenia who were too delusional to recognize that they were even ill. You describe a man who, you write, sat immobile for days in the frozen snow in a local park because voices told him the earth would implode if he even moved a toe. Tell us more about that situation, if you can remember.
Yeah, well, that is not uncommon. I mean, if you went to Bellevue or any big city or even small town, emergency room, this is the kind of, these are the kind of cases that you get. And, hearing voices is a very powerful thing. Obviously, in the vernacular, their reality testing is impaired. So they either feel compelled by voices to act in a certain way. In other words, those are called command hallucinations, or threatened. If this happens, something awful will happen. One patient was afraid that if the traffic light turned red, it meant that her daughter would die. I mean, these kinds of, wildly fantastical, in different settings, they'd be considered very creative, kinds of fantasies about what can happen, what kinds of tragedies can happen in this world. But they're believed, and they take on a incredible force, and they sometimes lead to murders. And those are the ones that make they shouldn't be called murders, because if you're not guilty by reason of insanity, that's not a murder. That murder would be
it's an accident. I mean, seriously, what did they think it is?
Someone, you were a perpetrator, but I mean, you did not have the mental. The technical term is mens rea, but the guilty mind, the proper cognitive presentation to have understood the situation. Actually, if I can give you a classic example of that, if you'd like, because everyone remembers this one. It was so dramatic. The Andrea Yates case from 2001. Yeah, she was the Houston mom who drowned her 5 kids. I think they were all under 10, systematically in the bathtub. She was religious at baseline, but at this point she developed religious delusions, and probably complicated by a postpartum state. And she thought that they were possessed, by the devil, and she was saving them by drowning them. And but there were elements of the case that could really confused, a jury, because initially she did not get found to be not guilty by reason of insanity. And that was because she waited for her husband to leave the house. She knew that I think her mother-in-law may be coming over, so she worked around that timing. And after she completed, she laid all the kids out on the bed. I think she left one in the bathtub, and she called the police. And she perfectly assumed that she would be executed. She would be arrested and executed, along with Satan, because she felt he inhabited her. But but she ultimately did get not guilty by reason of insanity. But the idea there is not that she did not. Let me back up and say, in most states, the not guilty by reason of insanity standard is that a person doesn't know what they're doing. Like, she might have thought they were paper dolls or something, didn't even recognize these entities.
Right. Like in a complete delusional state.
Yeah. Or that the person didn't know what they were doing was wrong. Well, she knew what she was doing was wrong in a technical state, and so did we can talk about this too. This is much fresher and horrific in its own right. The case of DeCarlos Brown, who killed the Ukrainian journalist. Right. They know it's wrong. In fact, he walked right into a knot of policemen when he wasn't trying to hide. He walked right into them, and then they handcuffed him, and he didn't resist. And so it's really not that they technically don't know things are wrong, but they don't have a sense of the wrongfulness, of the nature of the crime, or the nature of the act, I should say, because for Andrea Yates, the nature of the act was salvation.
Okay, I do want to get to this horrific story in Charlotte that you just mentioned, the DeCarlos Brown. This was the killing of Irina Zarutska. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. Back in August, and there's a lot of moving pieces to that story, although perhaps not as many as some people would like to think. But first, can you just talk, Sally, about why you got into this field and what it was like when you first became interested in psychiatry? I mean, it sounds to me like you wanted to practice community health. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but you were wanting to do something other than see rich people lying on a couch for analysis.
Never. And I don't think I'd be good at it, to be honest. I used to not tell this story, but I don't mind anymore. I went to graduate school before I went to medical school. I was never pre-med. I never thought about it. Where I went to college, it was so competitive. If I was grateful I wasn't pre-med. And but I always wanted to, I was very inspired by the romance of Darwinian biology. So I went to graduate school in evolutionary biology. And while I was there, I developed an infection, and the common treatment for it was high dose steroids, prednisone. And maybe you know what's coming next, but it's not uncommon on high doses to develop a psychosis. And
you were taking this for something else, just to be clear. You were prescribed prednisone for
inflammation, which is prednisone is still one of the greatest inflammatory drugs. But if you're on it long term, you can have lots of side effects in your body. Develop diabetes, your skin, arteries get thinner. It's really problematic. But in the short term, it's not, except for the fact that if it's high dose, and I guess you have some sort of innate I don't think I have a predisposition to psychosis, but I did under those chemical circumstances. I didn't have hallucinations or anything. I actually got just morbidly, profoundly, immobilizingly depressed. And I also developed something that neurologists are familiar with called receptive aphasia, most people have heard of expressive aphasia, and it's usually with a stroke, not always, but it's clearly a brain phenomenon. It is very reductive in that way. And an expressive aphasia, which is more common, is that you know what you want to say, but you just can't form the words. Receptive aphasia is more rare, and it's a condition in which you can't understand what people are saying to you. It's just it makes no sense. So I mean, I remember reading the newspaper, and it said something about, it's funny, it said something about carpets, and I remember thinking, why would someone need a pet in a car? You know,
Oh,
and
wow.
then another word was,
so it was, yeah.
Oh, then I was reading another word like rugged, and I thought, what's the past tense of rug? You know, none of this made. Yeah. So
Right.
it wasn't, again, you know, the kind of psychotic phenomenon we've been discussing, but it was bad enough. And I was out of school for not long, you know, maybe like 2 months, and I had a wonderful doctor, and you know, and I told him, it took about 2 weeks for this to set in. This effect. And I told him.
And this was an undergraduate?
It was my first year of graduate school.
Okay.
And I said to him, I'm going nuts. And he said, oh God, it's the steroids. And I said, why didn't you tell me this? And the thing with steroids is if you're on them for, especially again, high dose, more than maybe a week or two, you can't just stop them. Because the steroids have already suppressed your natural adrenal function, so you're not producing as much norepinephrine, and epinephrine is normal. So if you were to stop the medication overnight, your adrenal glands can't catch up overnight. So then you would go into adrenal failure, which is actually Addison's disease, which is a strange feedback loop with JFK here, which is what he had. But he had it from, I don't know if he had an immune, infection of the adrenal glands or why his were dysfunctional, but he had Addison's disease, remember? And
I don't remember that. Yeah. Okay.
And so in any case, it took 6 to 8 weeks to completely taper it down to 0. And it was just, it was kind of a devastating experience. I was so grateful that it was something that could be reversed, that it was temporary. It was due to, what we'd call an exogenous substance. In other words, just something I took, not something I am, or something that's part of my neurochemistry. It didn't revolt on me on its own. But I knew there are people out there who, whose neurochemistry did. And I just felt just such a sense of, I don't want to sound grandiose, but almost like mission to help them in some way. And that's when I decided to go to become a psychiatrist. So I went to medical school to be a psychiatrist. I didn't go to medical school and then figure out what I wanted to do.
We don't have to get too far into this, but I want to ask you something I've always wondered. What is it like to go to medical school when you know you're going to be a psychiatrist? Like, do you have to just kind of like hold your nose and get through all these rotations and study all these things that you know that you're not going to need?
No, not at all. And God damn it, Meghan, you do need, okay, you don't need gross anatomy. I'll grant you that.
No, I'm not saying you don't need it, but it just must be like, oh, do I need to like know how to like deliver a baby or something like that?
You know what I mean? There were other options if I didn't want to go a medical road. And no, I love gross anatomy. I actually was a TA for gross anatomy 5 times. I could have told you absolutely every bone, every tendon, absolutely every blind alley in your, every membrane in your body. Can't do that now. But in any case, because the department that I was in graduate school was actually responsible. It's really such a coincidence of things, but it was responsible for teaching medical students gross anatomy and histology, which is biology of tissues, and neuroanatomy. So that was half of the first year of medical school, sort of right there. And I was a TA for gross anatomy, and I met. This was at the University of Chicago, and the medical students were amazing. They were so unlike. I'd been to Cornell before, which was really competitive, and everyone was a chemistry major or a biology major, or and And at the University of Chicago, like more than half the class were history majors, or English majors. And I thought, and they were also, maybe this was just the affliction of being from the Midwest. I don't know. They were wonderful. They weren't cutthroat, and they had such a much broader view of what they were doing. And it was really seductive. And I thought, and I also had always been under the impression that you had to be brilliant to go to medical school. Yeah, you have to be smart and you have to be brilliant to, work in a lab often, and make, important basic science discoveries. But you have to be smart. But, and from there, there's of course, a whole range from brilliance to smart. And so it also made it clear to me that it was doable.
You have written in recent years about ideological capture at medical schools, just this kind of blurring the lines between medicine and activism. This is something that we're seeing in more recent cohorts of medical students and doctors. What was the climate when you were training? Was this happening yet?
No, I feel really protected from it. I should rephrase that. I wasn't protected because there was nothing to be protected from. I did not sense it, at all. The only dimension of training that was, you might say, a tiny bit politicized was work at the Veterans Hospital when PTSD. I mean, obviously PTSD existed, during the Peloponnesian War. I mean, animals even probably have post-traumatic stress disorder. Sometimes it's not very adaptive. So maybe those, they don't live so long. So natural selection takes care of the ones that are, but basically, PTSD at its core is a fear response that's just not extinct, doesn't extinguish over time, doesn't end. And so it was entered officially into the DSM in 1980. And the VA, which of course had always been treating, people with post-war psychological complications, but now it was a real entity, and the VA invested a ton more money in it. And that became not ideological. We're not talking ideological victimology. It wasn't group-based, but it was definitely constructive in some ways for sure, but also very much caught up with the risk of inculcating victimhood in some of these. Well, I'm going to say guys because it was almost all men at the time. And the disability system there, which hasn't really improved very much, believe it or not, was, again, well-meaning, like so many of these things, but ultimately, really created a perverse incentive for these guys to stay sick, because you would lose your benefit money if you improved. So that was a big problem. We're working against that. I was personally cared a lot about the fact that the guys were spending a lot of their benefit money on drugs, and I'm running the drug treatment unit, and they're, at the beginning of the month, everyone's coming in because they're overdosing or took too much cocaine or, drank too much. And so that was, again, well-meaning, but not constructive. And so that was really the beginning of my kind of first policy impulse, which is, is there a way to help these guys manage their money so that, their basic needs are covered, obviously, but so that they could essentially kind of earn back the rest as the discretionary funds by like submitting clean drug screens or something. I mean, it's called contingency management. That's a classic, scenario, behavioral strategy. And, you would have to, you can imagine, the VA is an incredible lobby. Veterans don't want anybody to touch their disability money, even if it's to manipulate it in a way that's constructive. But that was interesting, and so we talked about that, and then I took a health policy fellowship in 93, and it was just kind of amazing that the year I took it, there was a congressman, Bill Cohen, who was the Secretary of Defense for Obama, right? And William Cohen. And but he was running the aging. He was the chairman of the Senate Aging Committee, so he was cared a lot about Social Security. Well, Social Security actually had its own disability program for people who were addicted. It was called the DANA program, Drug Abuse and Alcoholism. It was developed in 1972, like everything else, well-meaning. But when you think about it, it's sort of perverse. We're going to give you federal support because you're too intoxicated to work. It's not.
And this is not just veterans,
this is
to be clear.
Security.
This is everybody.
Well, some veterans got both Social Security and Social Security.
Right.
To be honest, it's not a lot of money. A VA 100% service connection disability is tax free at well over $3,000 a month, which isn't bad, especially if you live in a kind of rural-ish area and your wife works. And I should hasten to say, an injured veteran deserves everything. I mean, an enormous sacrifice, and I just, of course. But again, we're talking now about, in the VA, sorry if I'm going all over the place, in the VA, you could only get money for a disability that was not addiction. In fact, the VA calls addiction willful misconduct, which has been a term it's used forever. It's a little quaint or offensive, depending on how you see it. But at the VA, people would not get their money for their addiction. They'd get it for something else, but they happened to also have a drug problem. And so that was the folks we were seeing. A lot of them were diagnosed with PTSD, but they were using the disability money for that they got for that on drugs.
Right.
Security had a special program within it that was just for addiction. And the idea was that, the idea wasn't bad on paper, that the money would go not to you, but to someone responsible person who could make sure your basics were taken care of and, what's your money. And you were required to go to drug treatment. So all that sounded good, except it wasn't time limited. So that's a problem. So it was indefinite. And also it turned out, and this was where Senator Cohen came in, he did, during the year that I was doing my fellowship, he had done this massive investigative report on this program. And it turned out that a lot of the recipients were spending their money, not only were they spending it on drugs, they made the bartender, the representative payee, and they weren't required. No one checked that they went to drug treatment. So it was really in disarray. And what was really pretty eye popping is that, when you apply for a disability benefit, if you can prove that you had this disability, whatever it is, a back so bad, you failed all PT and you just couldn't work, but you didn't convince them you had this problem, because often people have to reapply and reapply and reapply. So really, for 5 years or 10 years, you've been trying to get this disability money. You finally get it. Then you get a massive check for all those dated back.
For the back pay.
I mean, in his report, remember, I was reading about it in the Washington Post in like 30 years ago. One person bought a crack house, bought a place to start a crack house. It wasn't good. It was just the kind of thing that Congress would, And so that program was actually Newt Gingrich on the contract with America and all that, rescinded it. But the senator I worked with, we wanted to transform it. So to make it work the right way and time limit it and call it a treatment scholarship.
What were the drugs that you were seeing at this time? Because you have since, like I said earlier, become very involved in opioid addiction policy and treatment. So when did you start to see a shift? I mean, I'm assuming you were dealing with the crack epidemic early on.
Yeah, it was mostly crack, although there's, these drugs, even though they come in cycles, it's rare that, stimulants are in ascendance. It's rare that heroin will ever go away or vice versa. Now we're seeing something where it's a little unusual, I think, where fentanyl and methamphetamine and stimulants are almost half and half. But But the stimulants, of course, are not as deadly. So the overdose rates have been going down since the summer of 2023. But yeah, it was all crack. And in fact, when I finished my residency, I wanted to work with people with psychosis. I still, that was the whole damn reason I went to medical. And, but I also wanted to stay in New Haven. I, want to move, and I had friends and I liked it there. And they said, well, that's very nice, but we need someone to run the drug treatment unit. And truthfully, I was not thrilled, but crack had arrived, and there was a presumption early on that crack would behave like methamphetamine, which was the speed era, the 50s and 60s, when there were lots of records of people who became psychotic from using too much methamphetamine
in the 50s and 60s. And I mean, and was it being called methamphetamine at the time, or is it sort of like Mother's Little Helper kind of stuff, or
speed.
What? That was okay. Speed, other direction.
Speed freaks, and so
right. Okay.
Right.
Okay, so you're running the drug program, even though you want to be working with just
and it was
plain old pure psychotics.
Just assumed that methamphetamine, that crack would behave like methamphetamine in terms of its effect, and it would cause psychosis. And I thought, oh my gosh, I'm going to get to study psychosis. So that's how I got it. That eased my entry into the field, and I've never left.
Okay. Well, let's get back to what we started talking about in the beginning, which is this piece that you wrote about Trump's. It's not necessarily a plan. It's some kind of, one of many things that he has said about this. It was a good
vision, which was to basically to use commitment laws, civil commitment laws, more liberally, and. Now, one doesn't want to use them more liberally from a normal baseline, but considering the fact that we don't use them at all, I shouldn't say at all, that's not right, but not as often as we should for people who are in a dire situation. He wanted to see them able to be enforced. It's you have to go through a lot of steps when you want to commit people. You have to go through a judge. You should go through a judge. You should have all these protections, because you certainly don't want to take anyone's liberties away without lots of oversight and good justification. His concern, I think the president's concern, was more on crime than on mental illness, but that's okay, because it would have been very helpful. So this gets us into basically, I think, two things. One are the conditions under which you can be committed, because there are at least three kind of standards for commitment: civil commitment and voluntary treatment. Those are all the same terms. And then what the heck we do with these folks when we do commit them, because there's such a dramatic bed shortage, which is due to a policy that needs to be changed. And we can get to that policy in a second. Should we go through those three standards?
Please.
Oh, okay. So the first is one almost everyone is familiar with, the danger standard. It's called immediate, and everyone is, there's a sense that it's kind of within 24 hours. Are you going to kill someone or kill yourself within 24 hours?
Okay.
So
is this the gravely disabled? I mean, this is, okay, we're going to get to that in a second.
Okay. So gravely disabled. So the first is a danger standard, where someone's life, literally their life is at risk. And then there's a little debate about what's imminent. Again, is it an hour from now or is it 24 hours? But it's usually a sense of 20. And then there's a grave disability standard. These are in order of decreasing, I guess, acuity, you could say. And a grave disability standard is one that the guy in the park who's freezing to death would have met, which is to say, you're not going to actively hurt yourself or someone else, but you are so delusional that you can't take care of yourself. You can't provide for your basic needs. And again, the classic situation is someone who is, freezing to death in the park, or someone who's so psychotic they're walking on the subway tracks that barely, they think it's a road or something like that.
Right.
And so that's number two. Okay. And then there's a third one called, it goes by two names, psychiatric deterioration standard or a need for treatment standard. They're sort of the same thing. And I should say that the first two that I mentioned, the imminent danger and grave disability, almost every state has that. About half of all states have the need for treatment standard. And, as the name implies, these are people who are not, they're certainly not endangering anyone acutely or themselves. They can manage, but they are on a deteriorating spiral that almost inevitably, if it's not interrupted, will end in a situation where they are a danger to themselves or others or gravely disabled. That one's a little more sensitive, as you can imagine, but that's the third. That's the third possibility, and so then the question, of course, is, okay, let's say you apply these and you have judges who are more receptive to it, and even now psychiatrists that are more receptive to it, because there's been a tension forever. There are lots of disability rights advocates, and they are really against this. They want, and this is true under the Americans with Disabilities Act. I mean, the Supreme Court did say that patients should be treated in the least constricted environments, and everyone wants that. But, at what price, for heaven's sakes? And so, but there's always a tension. Well, if he can manage on his own, or, no, he cannot manage on his own. This person needs to come in.
And are we talking generally about people who are on the street, or like are first responders, or I don't know if it's the police or whoever, like you can go into somebody's house and can they ostensibly be living with relatives and still meet one of these criteria and be taken away?
I mean, put it this way, a person, who's languishing in their parents' back bedroom could probably exist there for a lot longer than if he were homeless.
Right.
So it depends on the context. It depends on those external supports. So being homeless is sort of an obvious circumstance under which someone would be picked up, and other people would call because they're concerned. But a parent can call, and it's usually easier, of course, if this is someone under 18. But relatives can call. Relatives can petition judges.
So, okay, and I do want to get to the Charlotte case in just a second, but first, how can we best understand why it is so difficult to get somebody committed? Because I hear story after story from, in some cases, people I know personally who have family members who are homeless, who are addicted and or psychotic, and there is nothing they can do to get them help. I mean, the people are outreach resistant, ostensibly police officers or social workers or whoever have come out and talked to them. Can we help you? Can we find you a shelter for the night? They say, no, no, no. People try to get, their family members off the street. And what they will say is that the law just doesn't help them. And is this in certain states?
No.
Is this like because of Democrat-run states, it's worse than other
That's a
places?
good question. I don't know the answer to that, but that's interesting. No, the law could help them. A lot of times, people really don't know the law. They don't understand it. So the law technically could help. It would be wrong not to civilly commit someone because there is no bed. It's like saying, I'm not going to arrest you if you've harmed someone because there's no room in the jail. You have to you have to accommodate that somehow.
Right.
But that's more on a policy level, that there's no room, and there could be if if Congress changed a law that would allow facilities with more than 16 beds to accept severely mentally ill people. This was something built in 1965 into Medicaid, I think, so that we wouldn't recreate mental hospitals. But you don't want, if you have less than 16 people, then it couldn't possibly be an institution. That was the idea.
Oh.
Anyway, just as a detour, if that law is called the IMD exclusion, institutions for medical disorders, I think, exclusion. If that were changed overnight, we'd have more beds. But in any case, you asked why it's so hard. So one is people really don't know what the laws are. So that's one. And two, increasingly, the social workers and maybe some of the lawyers involved are well, some of the lawyers actually counsel their, because you can have a lawyer as a patient, which, you should have some representation, of course, but they counsel them on what to say. Because some people, they are psychotic, but in certain circumstances, you really can kind of pull yourself together in the short term.
Oh, yeah. There's a script, I'm sure.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Train them what to say. There's some of that going on.
What kinds of things are they trained to say?
Like, oh, yes, I'll come back from my appointments. Oh, yes, I realize there's something, wrong. I haven't been taking my meds, but I know I need help, this kind of thing. So another mentality is, the rights-based mentality, which of course I have sympathy for, but you can't really let that cloud your judgment about, what is in best interest for those patients. The autonomy. This is a whole civil liberties, argument, which again has been an issue for forever. Then also, I think there's a sensitivity to sort of tolerance. If this is what the patient wants, then we're being tolerant by letting them determine, their situation. And then sometimes there's an element of race in it. I hate to say that, but where it could look like you're being more, it looks punitive. And if this patient happens to be a minority and everyone else involved is not, then it takes on that, that flavor as well.
Right. Let's talk about this case in Charlotte. This was, there was, Irina, she was 23 years old. She was riding the bus, I believe, or was it a light rail, some kind of mass transit on the way home from work. And there was a man, DeCarlos Brown, is that right? Is that his name? Who just stabbed her repeatedly, and she died right there. What was the backstory there?
Well, it's just devastating. Apparently Brown was schizophrenic. He was 34. He was diagnosed sort of late. He was diagnosed when he was 30 or 29. And that was right after he'd come out of being incarcerated for, I think, theft. He had a record of criminal, criminal activity. And schizophrenia, I don't know if he used drugs or not. I don't believe drugs were involved at the time. But usually schizophrenia is something that manifests in your late teens or mid-20s. So it would be a little late. But I suspect he was probably more quietly psychotic for a long time. But his main delusion centered on this notion that there was some kind of material that was put in his body. I don't think he had a sense of by whom, and that it was directing his thoughts and actions. And that's what, made him kill her. And in fact, he told his mother that he was on the train that day to go to the hospital. And he'd been hospitalized before to get the material removed. Within the year before, he called 911 like 20 times, saying, this is like a lot of people think when something's wrong, the police are the answer. It's sort of touching, actually. And so he called them, and so I mean it was just so delusional. And when he spoke to his sister afterwards, they have the tapes of these when he was incarcerated before he went to a psychiatric hospital where he now is, presumably to be made competent to stand trial. And that and that could never happen. I mean, there are some people that are never made competent to stand trial, so they effectively stay in a forensic hospital, forever. But he told her, why would I do that? I didn't know her. it was the, material in me. I mean, someone might be cynical about the whole thing, thinking this is just some story, but it's too consistent. Never tried to
Yeah, it's
contain
pretty
the law.
specific. Right. Yeah, he called. So in January 2025, he repeatedly called 911 about a man-made material inside him that was controlling his body. And I think sort of, in 2024, his mother had tried to have him committed. He was denied. Associated Press reported that involuntary commitments are difficult to obtain unless a court finds that a person is dangerous. North Carolina reduced the capacity of state hospitals in the early 2000s. So just to your point, the average wait time for a psychiatric bed was 16 days in 2024. And so when he stopped taking his psychiatric medication, his mother took him to a homeless shelter.
No, it's just two tragedies, and the tableau, the visual of this was galvanizing. I mean, this sweet, blonde, innocent girl, and the black gentleman who looked a little bit wild. Side by side. President Trump, wrote and tweeted or something. He must get. I'm forgetting the exact words, but basically the death penalty. I mean, definitely said the death penalty. And the state of North Carolina actually passed Irina's law that would make it easier. They haven't used the death penalty there since 2006. And this bill would have reduced some of the barriers to implementing it again. And in addition to it, was a firing squad, because apparently there's a problem with injecting. The whole thing is just, incredibly.
Oh, right. Yes, exactly. You mean the death penalty by firing squad, which seems
and I admit,
draconian.
I am not in theory against the death penalty. I mean, if it were outlawed tomorrow across the country, I'd be fine with it. I would never, not something to go to the mat for. But I think in theory, but in the case of a person who commits a crime, when their crime is a product of psychosis, then I think it's unconstitutional to, even make them eligible for it. And not, you may be thinking, well, clearly he would get an NGRI, not guilty by reason of insanity plea. Well, it's not a guarantee. And so we would fall between the cracks and would be, and given, the scrutiny and the optics of this case, I would think he sadly would have a high chance of being on death row.
Yeah. I feel like I recall reading stuff around this case that had to do with like the judge that had sort of, released him several times, was maybe not even a judge, but a magistrate. I'm not sure what the difference between those two things are. It had some kind of interest in a nonprofit that was mixed up in, people's catch and release. I'm not exactly sure of the details. And granted, I'm just getting this from ex Twitter, so it's probably conspiratorial nonsense. But do you know any of the details
of all the missed opportunities? And I know, hindsight is 20/20, but in this case, for 5 years, there was a very robust record of danger, of impairment in this guy. And, so I think when we look back, we could really see places where things should have happened, not could have happened. And
right.
Yeah. And so,
well, this is like the Jordan Neely case in New York, right? So this was the case of the Michael Jackson impersonator, Jordan Neely, who had just many, many, many instances of many arrests and, violent, out of control encounters and behaviors, and then was subdued and inadvertently killed, died while being subdued by Daniel Penny. Of course, this was a huge case. The racial optics are reversed, of course. But everyone who lives in New York can imagine exactly how that kind of thing could go down. And we see a version of it every day.
Yeah. So, I mean, there was supposed to be a hearing last week I guess that was independent of whether he was competent to stand trial. But it didn't happen. All the news reports said that his lawyer, the Brown's lawyer, asked for the delay until April, and they said the reasons were redacted. So I don't know. We don't know why.
Well, why do you think this is happening? Is it getting worse as the decades go on? I mean, this started with back in the early 60s. We got rid of the insane asylums, and now we've had people on the street. Like, what has gone wrong, and what do you, Dr. Sally Satel, think can be done about it, if anything?
Well, I think that, as I mentioned, that law about being able to expand hospital beds would be absolutely huge. That's what advocates for severely mentally ill people have been arguing forever. We do need more clinics they're called, I can't believe, of course, I'm blocking on it now. They're behavioral health clinics, and they're federally funded, and they do have a lot of these wraparound services, and they have what are called like respite beds. So in other words, if you're, so many people who are mentally ill live in families that are, chaotic. Some of that chaos has been inadvertently brought on by their mental illness, in their family, just because it's hard to live with someone, who's either threatening you or, and so they need a break. They just need a damn break that could really kind of stop the escalation. And some of these facilities have these, really short-term beds. They're not even hospitals. More psychiatrists who are qualified and interested in, treating this population, maybe pay us more.
Yeah. Are people not wanting to go into this?
No, it's mostly a lot of foreign grads go into it. That's so many of the psychiatrists weren't even trained in this country. Doesn't mean they aren't very, they could be very good. Especially if they're not that acculturated, I think it's times difficult to, make connections with patients when language and, subtle cultural cues are so important. So maybe it's not the optimal workforce. So, yeah, I mean, right now people are in jail. That's where they are. You've heard that. Rikers is California. But Los Angeles County Jail is like the biggest mental institution in the country. And Rikers, I think, is second. And then the streets are, maybe third. And and then there are the scarce hospital beds. But I was always, interested in what is called a neo-asylum movement. Bring back the asylums, for heaven's sakes. Now we have medication, so they would not necessarily be a lifelong residence for some people, but they might be for years. There's just a minority. It is a minority of these folks who just don't respond. And you'd need, this is, I feel like kind of a throwback to the mid 1800s when Dorothea Dick, she was a real, advocate for the severely mentally ill, and she pioneered what was called moral treatment. But it took place in these pastoral, environments where there were animals and it was a farmer.
Yeah, a sanitarium.
And I think that there those kind of things. I've always wanted to start one, but I need some land. Anyone listening, it would be so hard, but. I think there are scattered hospitals that, have been trying to do this, but let's make more models.
Yeah. I mean, I think Trump said, one of many, many things he has said, which is something I think I have certainly wondered about myself. Like, why can't we build like compounds out in the desert that would have, beds for these people and also outdoor space and wraparound services?
They have workshops where folks, and they could do things. Often they grow enough food and.
So why is this so difficult? I mean, obviously there's NIMBYs, everywhere who are not going to want this built down the road. But
NIMBYism, but because the advocates are so opposed to this idea of hospitalization, of containment. And they're certainly right to be fearful of abuses of this, for heaven's sakes. But if anything, now the abuses are in the other direction, where we can't intervene soon enough, or in a more, in a dramatic enough way to really, make a difference. And it also, it brings up the idea that this is not all environmentally induced. This is genetic. These conditions have a big genetic loading, which is not to say environment doesn't exacerbate things. A dangerous, uncertain environment is terrible for this kind of situation. And of course, these folks are much more likely, you've heard this before, but it always bears saying again, the victims when they're homeless than the perpetrators. I think they kind of want to acknowledge that there are some people who are just this sick, and it is genetic, and that, but they can be helped significantly if they're in a contained, benign situation.
What is going on with these advocates? Are they just naive? Are they just so wedded to their agendas?
Because, one reason is, they used to be paid by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Service, under a program called Protection and Advocacy. And the protection part was fine, but the advocacy part was they tended to hire lawyers who were kind of hell-bent on springing people from these hospitals. And there's a horrible case in Maine where I'll never understand this. There was a hearing on this years ago, maybe 10 years ago in the House, about how these lawyers could manage with a little coaching, but they managed to get this, I want to say he's like a 25-year-old young man who was very violent to his family before. His parents finally got him into this hospital in Maine, and they, against the doctor's own, this is what I don't understand, how this could override the clinical impressions of the physicians at this hospital. He's not ready to leave, but they facilitated his discharge, and he murdered his mother. That's one example. It sounds dramatic, yet that there have probably been scattered other murders or things of that gravity. But, every time there's a murder, this is a tip of the iceberg phenomenon. That means below it is assault, and below it there is, throwing chairs around and making it impossible, and threatening your parents. And it's a disaster. And they were very destructive. My own theory is that at least some of the original activists, this is a theory, but many of them were in psych hospitals themselves and were mistreated. And what I think they were mistreated because, it could be they were just plain old mistreated, weren't as enlightened then. That maybe I ran into some not very enlightened staff, but I think that a number of these people who, again, were in their 20s and teens in the 1960s, took LSD, took drugs, had a terrible trip, and were psychotic, and were brought into a hospital. And those were the days where they didn't rush you out of these hospitals. You could stay a long time.
This was the girl interrupted
Yeah, that
period.
was a private hospital. But yeah, even in public hospital.
But same era, though, right?
And so they were people who, in 3 days, they slept, ate, they were fine. And I could easily see them not being able to convince the staff, to basically let them go. So they had a bad experience. And I think they just generalized way too much from what they encountered. That's sort of an old school disability person.
That's fascinating. I like that theory, but those people are going to age
out. They are aging
who
out.
do we have coming in now?
The social justice brigade. Yeah.
Right. And again, I know you're not a homelessness expert, but I live in Los Angeles, and all over the place are encampments, people who are addicted and or mentally ill. And you've got like an absolute inability for law enforcement to do anything about it. And I suppose it's because you've got NGOs and this entire activist core like just thinking that we can't take away their rights, that like you can have piles of garbage and shopping carts and like living these inhumane conditions because of
well,
because civil
Larry
liberties.
Laurie is not. Isn't he trying to do something, or it's? Well, you would know.
Well, we have Karen Bass here. Interestingly, in San Francisco,
city. I'm from New York.
I'm talking about I'm in Los Angeles, but it's funny that you say that because I am hearing increasingly that in San Francisco, things just got so bad that they have finally made a dent in it because people are realizing this is not a partisan issue. This is not like social justice lefties versus like Silicon Valley libertarians. This is quality of life for everybody.
That's the other thing. I mean, these advocates just don't have any sense, which is not in a way a surprise, of the larger context. These are people who are making life uninhabitable for others, while those same individuals are living in squalor, and it's a kind of hell. It's really, these are environments that were designed by evil, an evil genius couldn't design them as well. You've got a concentration of people who are given these. They may not be given drugs. Sometimes they are given drugs, like a safe supply situation.
Well, the harm reduction programs, which I wanted to talk with you about. Yeah.
So they're supplied the way to use these drugs. They are if they have to buy them, that's not so bad because they're very cheap. They're obviously ubiquitous everywhere. There are no consequences for using. They're completely normalized. And the drugs that they're using are among the most addictive we've ever seen, which is fentanyl and methamphetamine. And methamphetamine, not only is it highly addictive, it is probably neurodegenerative. It probably does, if used heavily over time, it probably does really harm brain tissue. So people aren't even, you can think pretty rationally actually between, I work in a methadone clinic. People come in having used fentanyl 3 hours before. They know what they're doing. And when you're in between episodes of withdrawal, you can often be kind of lucid. So methamphetamine, that's harder. But again, when these people do come in to the methadone clinic, it's because I actually just saw a lady today who found out she's 34. She found out she was pregnant. Okay, that's enough. Or someone's wife, is going to leave them, or someone's parole officer is going to violate them, or a boss is going to fire. That's enough. People do.
Wait, what do you mean that's enough? Sorry, that's enough for what?
The door to a methadone clinic.
I see.
But when you're out living on the street, where are the consequences? Who's the boss who's going to fire you? Who's the mother who's going to cry because you don't come in? You're not seeing her.
No. And they want, again, I know this is not your area, but all these kinds of manipulations of data, they'll say like, well, people were offered, when asked if they're interested in a shelter bed that night, 93% say yes. Okay, interested is not the same as will you go? And if interested only if you don't use in that shelter bed, and if the answer is no, then the data gets recorded a particular way. It's just so misleading.
In treatment programs, in Oregon, that was part of their whole decriminalization effort in 2020, which has since been repealed, which is that, there's a certain amount that's decriminalized if you're caught with it. And frankly, nothing you could use. But if you're somehow attracting the attention of the police, you are given $100. You are told to call, basically a hotline to get a bed, or if you don't do that, you pay, $100 fine. And I think they had 1% infinitesimal uptake of treatment, and who knows how long people stay. All the data are consistent that within a year, between 50 and 80% of people drop out of treatment programs.
Right.
Which is why drug courts are great things. That's where if you get arrested, that you would go to a supervised treatment program, and if you complete it, your charges are dropped. So it's a good deal.
Okay, but you need to be able to get arrested in order for that to work.
It's not that hard if they would enforce like municipal violations, this kind of thing.
Right, that's
You
what I
can't do
mean.
that.
Yes,
right.
But right,
But
yeah.
as far as harm reduction, there's a taxonomy here, and it's sort of you touched on one of the, I think, 4 general motivations, and they do overlap. So one is sort of the tolerance idea, that moral people or more moral society is tolerant, and if we're going to be moral, we're going to tolerate this kind of lifestyle. But of course, there's a point at which toleration turns into complicity, and that's where they are. But this is born out of a kind of benign sentiment. I mean, misguided, I think, but still benign. An overarching one is to normalize drug use. Then there's kind of the, as I said before, sort of the rights folks, but there's all rights and no responsibilities in their vision. And then there's a social justice project, which is using these folks, I think, as pawns, showing that this is the failure of housing, this is the failure of capitalism. Here they are, and
racism.
Yes. Not even necessarily a rig, but they do throw white supremacy in there, and and these are people with a completely different agenda. I've read so many stories of people who were on the street once themselves and would ask them, do you have any info when they're coming around with their pipes and tinfoil? I think I might want to go into treatment. Do you have any path? No, we don't do that. No, we don't do that. It's if they're almost discouraging it. And I should back up and say, Meghan, that I think of harm reduction in two forms, 2 species of harm reduction. And one is called, the better one is called aspirational harm reduction. Because listen, there are people who don't want treatment. I mean, what are you going to do if they're not gravely disabled? You really can't commit them. But aspirational harm reduction could be needle, exchange, could be any of this. But the idea is that, of course, you want to reduce, as the name implies, you want to reduce harm. And there's a hell of a lot of harm out there now with fentanyl because it's 50 times more potent than heroin. But the idea, the culture of that help is that you will be, we want to usher you into a drug treatment program, or we want you just improve your life. Not everyone needs a drug treatment program. They need sometimes just a massive change of environment. But in any case, that's our goal for you. And we'll see you tomorrow. And so we'll do, but and in fact, our methadone clinic has really evolved. I think a lot of methadone clinics are. I think they're getting a bad rap, really, where now we give people sort of the thing in a methadone clinic is take home. So you can get your methadone to take home so you don't have to come every day. And if you, are a patient in good standing for a certain amount of time, you can get a whole month, which is just like whatever it is now that you for your blood pressure medication or whatever. So, but now we let people kind of attain that status much more quickly. Like we're just satisfied if they use less heroin or less fentanyl. And there are debates about that because we, sometimes the take-home policy can be used as an incentive itself to shape behavior. So, how much you want to lower the threshold for giving people latitude it's a debate. We'd rather keep our rules a little more stringent so people can again earn these freedom. But the point is, we would never say to somebody in the old days, "Oh, you're only using a gram a week. That's fantastic." We'd never say that.
This is the everybody gets a trophy school of drug treatment. So, I mean, what kinds of conversations do you have with patients when they come in? Is it combative? Is it tense? Like what? Not combative, but like, do you ever get in their face and say,
no, but the counselors do. I mean, usually you have to have been an addict yourself to, the credibility for that. And in my clinic, it's mostly African-American, not completely, but mostly Black patients and mostly Black staff. So I don't see myself doing that, but some of the other folks will, and it works. But you have to know, you don't do that the first day. You have to know what a person will respond to, how you get their attention. And if you say it with contempt, and if you don't say it with obvious concern, it's really going to blow up in your face. But no, people want to get, if they don't, some people don't want to, it depends on their age. The average age in our clinic is 57. So these people have been most of them also use cocaine to some degree. They've been involved with drugs for a really long time, often in their, teens. And they've been in and out of drug treatments. And some of them decide, okay, I've been in and out of methadone 7 times. And the only time I'm drug free is when I'm incarcerated. So maybe I'll just stay on methadone for the rest of my life. Fine. It's got very few side effects, really. And as I said, if you are a patient in good standing, meaning you give basically clean samples and you come to some groups that we have, whatever, you can get a month's worth at a time. So it's not nearly as disruptive. And some people like the idea. In fact, when they're new to the clinic, they want to come in every day because they're not working. So that's structure. They interact with counselors. We always say, go home, because outside every methadone clinic, there's a bus stop where people are selling drugs. So go home. But they want that. They want that interaction and organization to their day.
Right. Well, there's so much more we could talk about. I don't want to go too far past the hour, but I do want to get your thoughts about Washington, D.C., where you live. We had recently Trump deploy the National Guard to do a number of things. As someone who doesn't live in D.C., I'm not entirely sure what those things were. On one hand, I'm hearing this is terrible. If it's not unconstitutional, it's certainly egregious and not requested. On the other hand, I have heard people saying, well, in fact, the city got cleaned up quite a bit, and I feel more comfortable going out to eat and sitting on the sidewalk and having my glass of wine and my dinner. So thank you, President Trump. What's the reality on the ground?
Well, my sense, I haven't interviewed men on the street and women on the street, but it's really the ICE situation that gets people very, very upset, and understandably. So really, that's kind of my answer to that. Actually, people I know, to be fair, is because in the medical world, is RFK. That's really
right,
energizing people, and that's, to me, extremely worrisome. I mean, I did like his idea, for RFK wasn't involved with the mental illness, but I'd written a piece a few weeks or months before that I think it said, I'm a psychiatrist. I agree with RFK on some of his ideas about drug treatment. There, I was more cautious because he never really came out in a full-throated way for methadone. He was very enthusiastic about farms, recovery farms. My attitude is let a million therapeutic flowers bloom. Some people, that'll work for some people. Others can't leave their kids, so they have to be in an urban setting. There are a lot of ways to, approach this. And so he didn't quite spend enough time on the array of options. But to be fair, he concentrate on the one that we talk about, the least, really, which is these kind of intensive programs that really do teach people skills. But, there's dropout rates that are often high at the beginning, and that was discussed. Mm-hmm. But, I'm for everything. And despite everything we've said, Meghan, overall, most people recover. And really? If they're alcohol, they do it without any formal treatment at all. And that was the case. That's been the case with drug addiction. I'm not sure, frankly, how fentanyl has changed that picture. But most people will quit. And these Gene Heyman, if anyone's interested in that, they can contact me, and I put them in touch with him, who's done some of the best work on this, the epidemiology of treatment and recovery, that by age 30, most people have, the majority of people who've had a serious drug problem have left it behind. And they've often done it on their own, which doesn't mean we don't need treatment. I don't hear it that way at all. But.
So what's the first call a friend or a family member should make if somebody's in real crisis in a way that they just can't, that they feel threatened, or they're just
Well,
they're just
police
lost as to
now
what to do.
have a lot of police stations. They've really made an effort to have these crisis response units where, a social worker comes out or a nurse. Now, if the person is violent, obviously you need police backup, but police ideally have learned de-escalation, tactics. So, hopefully they'd be among the better trained. I mean, there really was a serious effort to do that. But if you have a mentally ill relative, it's never the first. Well, I guess it has to start somewhere, of course. But for most people, they've been through it, so they kind of know the more responsive, helpers in the community, and they really should have significant backup plans for these kind of things. And in fact, I don't think this is used very much at all, but sometimes patients even have these what are called treatment. I'm not using the wrong term, but treatment contracts where they sign a binding, it's legally binding document that says if I get psychotic and I kind of I've lost touch, I want you to commit me. I want you to commit me. I think it's very, but then at the time, of course, they're refusing. And again, doctors have a hard time going against the stated wishes. A more benign example of that is people who sign their organ donor card, for heaven's sakes, and God forbid, die in a tragic way. And the family.
Well, DNR orders are not respected.
So it's hard to override these things, but those contracts exist, and sometimes they must be observed.
Yeah. Well, people are talking about tattooing DNR orders to their bodies in some ways. This is, I recently interviewed somebody. This apparently is latest trend, latest great idea. Well, Sally, this is fascinating. I'm so grateful for the work you do and the way you talk about it. Where can we find you if people want to know more about your work? Where should they go?
Okay. I have a website with everything I've ever done. It's SallySatelMD.com. And more recently, I started like everyone else, of course, a Substack called Off Label. So that's how.
Okay. We will link to that for sure. I thought you were going to say you started a podcast or a YouTube channel. I said, no, don't go there. Practice harm reduction. Content creator harm reduction program. Let's start with that. Don't start a podcast. Yes. Well, Sally, thank you so much, and I hope we'll talk again soon.
Thank you very much.
That was my conversation with Dr. Sally Satel. She is the medical director of a methadone clinic in Washington, D.C., and the author and/or co-author of numerous books, including Drug Treatment, The Case for Coercion, and One Nation Under Therapy. Right after we recorded this interview, Sally emailed me to ask if I would add that anyone needing guidance on treatment and legal options for a severely mentally ill loved one should look up the Treatment Advocacy Center in Arlington, Virginia, which is a very useful resource no matter where you are. So that's at tac.org, and I will link to it in the show notes. This is the Unspeakeasy Podcast, formerly known as the Unspeakable Podcast, which is still the URL on Substack, which is where you can go to become a paying subscriber if you're not already, or upgrade your subscription. Paying subscribers now have access to weekly discussion threads. This is a new thing. Every Monday morning, I'll drop a question or a topic or some kind of prompt, and people can discuss amongst themselves in the comments. I am also reinstating our Zoom Hangouts for founding members. So starting next year, I will be doing these every month. Yes. We're going to just meet on Zoom privately, not recorded, talk about the show, talk about whatever you want. Whoever shows up, I will hang out with you. So if you want to get in on that, upgrade your subscription to founding members. You can also find the podcast on YouTube. And I would encourage you to go over there if you're any kind of YouTube person, because I'm making an effort to grow the channel. Or maybe you're watching on YouTube right now, in which case, please like and subscribe, hit the bell, do that YouTube stuff, leave an intelligent comment. Finally, Once again, I am teaching a writing workshop on Zoom in personal essay and memoir early next year. It's running for 8 consecutive Tuesdays, January 6th through February 24th from 3 to 5 p.m. Eastern Time. You have to apply, and the application deadline is December 5th. You can get all the info by going to the Substack post I did about this, which is also in the show notes. And you can also find out about our Unspeakeasy 2026 retreat season at theunspeakeasy.com. I will be back next time with another super nuanced guest. Thanks for listening. See you then.